When we talk about slavery, the spotlight always goes on the brutality of white men, but what they don't tell you is this. Thousands of black men were abused, tortured, and even sexually violated by white women who owned them. Yes, white women. This is the hidden chapter, the dirty secret buried in America's foundation. And today, we're pulling it back into the light. Once you hear it, you'll never look at history the same again. If you believe truth should never be buried, hit that like button and subscribe so more Africans can find this hidden truth. Now, let's go deeper. First, a simple fact. White women were not just bystanders in slavery. They were owners, they were controllers, they were punishers. They bought, sold, whipped, starved, and terrorized people. They managed households where black men woke up every day under their eyes, under their orders. Some of those women also used that power to control men's bodies and men's lives in ways people rarely name out loud. Let us set the wider scene. Slavery was a machine built on death and fear. On the journey from Africa to the Americas, called the Middle Passage, historians estimate that about 13 out of every 100 captives were killed by disease, starvation, torture, suicide, and murder. That is 13% of men, women, and children dying trapped in chains in the bottom of ships. Sharks even learned to follow those ships because bodies were thrown overboard. Think about that, even the ocean remembered. In the Caribbean sugar islands, the system was so deadly that life expectancy for enslaved people was often less than 7 years after arrival. Enslaved men there were worked until their bodies broke, and then replaced with new captives. That is not a metaphor, that is a business model. Death rates were extreme. On Jamaican sugar estates in the late 1700s and early 1800s, scholars have measured very high annual mortality, showing a world where illness, injury, and punishment piled up year after year. That is the background noise of this story, the steady hum of suffering. Now we step inside the house. White women were not soft shadows in the house, many were active masters. The historian Stephanie Jones Rogers proved this in a landmark study that showed white women bought, sold, and punished enslaved people as their property. They used the market, the whip, the law, and the intimacy of the home to control lives. Inside that power, black men faced a special kind of danger. The danger of being close to the mistress who could smile by day and order pain by night. The danger of being forced to play strong worker, silent servant, and target of rage all at once. We will not rely on rumor. We listen to men who lived it. We say their names, we give their words ear, and we let their truth stand. Lewis Clarke was born enslaved in Kentucky. He escaped, and in 1845 he published his story. He wrote about a white mistress, Mrs. Bonton, who made cruelty her daily work. His words are plain. He said, "She has cut my flesh most horribly, and then bathed me with salt and water." That's a man remembering a woman who sliced his skin and rubbed salt into the wounds for sport. Lewis Clarke wrote it, signed it with his life, and put the world on notice. Henry Watson, another enslaved man, published his narrative in 1848. He described his owner's wife with chilling simplicity. In his words, she took delight in torturing and inspired everyone about her with terror. He is not guessing. He is not exaggerating. He was there. He lived under her roof, beneath her hand, and he survived to testify. Louis Hughes, enslaved in Mississippi and Tennessee, wrote a memoir in 1897. He remembered a mistress whose rage was constant and casual. "Some weeks it seemed I was whipped for nothing, just to please my mistress, fancy." There is no mystery in that line. A grown man forced to stand still while a white woman decided his back needed stripes. That is power, that is violence, that is slavery in the kitchen and the yard. These are not isolated stories. Frederick Douglass told us something people still do not want to hear. He described white daughters of slaveholders using sexual power over black men, choosing men's bodies for their own use, and even promising favors to control the outcome. In one case, Douglass wrote of a young white woman who selected a broad-shouldered black youth to be the father of her child, and promised him papers so he would not take revenge. Translate that into direct words. A white woman used a black man's body without his free say, and controlled him with the promise of freedom. That is sexual coercion. That is abuse. Let us slow down and say this clearly. Sexual violence against enslaved men happened. It is often hard to find because white society tried to hide it, and black men had every reason to stay silent to survive. Silence does not mean safety. Silence means fear. In recent years, historians have gathered the threads and laid them out. They show that white women sometimes forced black men into sex, threatened them with sale or whipping, or used their power to demand touch and obedience. This is not a rumor, it is part of the record. Why did this stay hidden for so long? Because many people are trained to imagine white women only as victims. Because telling the truth about their power inside slavery breaks the old story. Because men who are abused carry shame that is not theirs, and people mock what they do not want to understand. We push through that today. We look at the law, the household, and the ways control reached into the body. Understand the law first. In colonial Maryland in 1664, if a white woman married an enslaved black man, she could be punished by being enslaved herself for the length of his life. Think about the message. The law made black male bodies a crime scene, and it turned white women's intimacy with black men into a target. The purpose was to control contact and to mark black men as dangerous property, not human partners. Later, in 1681, an Irish woman named Nell Butler married an enslaved black man named Charles. She was punished under that same system. The law was not protecting love. It was punishing any bond that crossed the color line, and it did so by marking the black man as a problem to be stamped out. Now the household. Many enslaved men lived within the reach of white mistresses every hour of the day. They were butlers, coachmen, carpenters, field hands who also worked in the yard and the house. This closeness made them vulnerable. When a mistress was jealous, a man could be whipped. When a mistress was angry at her husband's crimes, a man could be punished as a substitute. When a mistress wanted control, she could use hunger, threats, and humiliation. Louis Hughes gives us an image. He worked day and night, then was called in and whipped because a mood shifted. His line again, short and sharp, just to please my mistress' fancy. That is the everyday nature of terror. The terror did not announce itself with a trumpet. It lived in small rooms and came down in quick orders. Lewis Clarke's memory of salt pressed into sliced skin shows another point. White women used water, salt, and cloth the way a torturer uses tools. The body of a black man became a practice board for pain. He was not allowed to step away, speak back, or claim his own skin as his own. His body belonged to her, and she made sure he knew it. Henry Watson's testimony shows the social effect. When the mistress inspired everyone about her with terror, that means children, other women, and men learned to fear her. Fear is a system, it is a habit, it is a climate inside the house. Men carried that fear in their muscles and their voices. They learned to lower their eyes, to speak soft, to read moods, to prepare for orders that could twist at any time. That is how power roots itself. There is even more, and it turns darker. Sexual coercion did not always look like the scenes people expect. It could look like a door closed and a whisper that sounded like a command. It could look like a quiet order to meet in the pantry or the smokehouse. It could look like a threat to sell a wife away if a man did not obey. Historians have gathered accounts where white women forced sex on black men, or forced them to father children to increase the owner's wealth or to serve the woman's desires. Douglass's account tells you the shape of it. A choice dressed up as an offer, with a promise that was also a chain. Some will say, where are the court cases? Where are the files? Understand this. Rape of enslaved men was not a crime that white courts cared to prosecute when white women were involved. White society built walls to protect white womanhood, not black manhood. When the powerful write the records, their crimes go missing. That is why survivor voices matter so much. That is why we cling to every word men like Douglass, Clarke, Watson, and Hughes were able to put on paper. Their books are not gossip, they are sworn memory. Let us pause and widen the frame again. On the ships, most captives were male. On a typical voyage in the database historians used to study the trade, men often made up the majority of those chained below deck. That matters because it tells you that black male bodies were a main target of capture and sale, and later a main target of work and punishment. It is the raw math of a system that fed on labor and fear. Back on land, the daily work was a slow grind that killed men by stress and injury. In the Caribbean, many men never lived long enough to see their children grow. In the United States, the population grew because forced births outpaced deaths, but that does not equal mercy, it equals a different kind of cruelty. Owners forced reproduction so they could sell babies. Men were sometimes ordered to breed, ordered to perform, ordered to make children on command. If a man refused, his family could be whipped or sold. If he obeyed, he carried shame he never asked to carry. This is what it looks like when power reaches inside your most private self. The violence from white women did not end with the last slave sale, it changed shape. In the age after slavery, the lie that black men were a danger to white women became a weapon that white communities used to lynch thousands. The journalist Etta B. Wells studied those murders and showed the truth. She wrote that less than a third of lynching victims were even accused of sexual crimes. Many were killed for nothing more than rumors, business jealousy, or asserting simple human dignity. That is what a lie can do when a whole society feeds it. The most famous case is a child, Emmett Till, 14 years old, killed in Mississippi in 1955 after a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, said he offended her in a store. Men kidnapped him, beat him, shot him, and threw him in a river. An all-white jury set his killers free. His mother showed his body to the world, and the world gasped, that was not an old story. That was yesterday in the long timeline of America. That was the echo of a system that taught people to fear black boys because white womanhood was treated like a shield. I promised we would explain clearly, so let me break it down in the simplest words without losing the weight. Slavery put white people in charge of black people. Many white women used that power to hurt black men. Hurt meaning whipping, starving, shaming, selling people away. Hurt also meant sex without a real yes. A yes given to avoid a whip is not a yes. A yes given because a woman can sell your mother is not a yes. That is abuse, that is rape, that is the truth we are saying out loud. Some people will ask, were there also kind white women? The system does not care about kind. The system made it normal for a white woman to order a black man to be beaten or sold. The system made it normal for a white woman to control who a black man married or when he saw his children. The system made it possible for a white woman to demand labor and silence, and to get both backed by the lash and the law. Even if one person smiled, the cage was still closed. You need images you can hold. Imagine Louis Hughes, shoulders tight, hearing his name called in a tone he knows means pain. Imagine Henry Watson, waking each morning with his chest tight, because the woman who runs the household inspires terror. Imagine Lewis Clarke standing still while salt burns into open cuts. Those are not scenes from a movie, those are memories from the men who lived them. You also need to hear the whispers that do not get written down. A quiet step down a hallway, a door closing. A man's voice lowered to a yes he does not mean. A promise of papers, a threat to sell his wife. A white woman using the same system that calls her delicate to do something brutal, and then hiding behind that same system to stay safe. Douglass handed us that script, he was telling us to stop pretending. Now let us talk about numbers again, because numbers can tell a story plain. On the ocean, about 13% died in passage. In the Caribbean, life after arrival often lasted less than 7 years. In America, the system produced more children than deaths because owners forced births to grow their wealth. In Jamaica and other islands, death outpaced birth because the work and hunger were that hard. The machine was always fed by bodies, and men's bodies were a big part of the feed. You might ask, why focus on white women? Because the old story pretends they had no power. Because this part of the truth needs light for healing to begin. Because many black men learned to fear the smile of a white woman, not because they hated women, but because their fathers had been whipped by one, or forced by one, or killed by men pretending to defend one. That fear has a history. There is another piece. Enslaved men were often trained to be silent about harm that touched their manhood. People told them that if a woman hurt them, it did not count. That is a lie. Power does not care about gender when it wants to control. It uses any hand available, and white women in slavery were a part of that hand. Saying this does not erase the harm white men did. It fills in the full picture, it refuses to hide half the truth. So what do we do with this knowledge? We hold it steady. We teach it to our children in words they can understand. We stop telling soft stories about the plantation house. We say the names of men who testified and believe them. We push schools to include the role of white women as enslavers. We push museums and films to show the full range of harm. We listen to scholars who studied the sexual violation of enslaved men, and we respect the courage it takes to put these facts on paper. And we act in the present. We call out any system that still uses the myth of protecting white womanhood to harm black men and boys. We back up our sisters and daughters while refusing the lie that our safety is a weapon to be pointed at our brothers. We learn from Etta B. Wells, who showed that lynching was often a cover for economic jealousy and racial control. We learn from Emmett Till, whose death still beats like a drum under American life. We do not repeat the lie, we break it. Before we end this, remember the simple human picture. A black man in a yard, sweating from work, hears the call of a white mistress. He cannot refuse. If he refuses, he risks the whip. If he obeys, he is still in a trap. That trap reached into his back and into his soul. It marked his sons, who learned to walk softly. It marked his daughters, who learned that their father's eyes carried stories he could not say. It marked the whole community, because none of us are untouched when one of us is chained. This is not about shame for being black. This is about clarity. When we tell the full truth, we take the power out of the lie. We honor the men who spoke and the men who could not speak. We honor the women who were punished when they tried to love freely. We honor the children who watched and learned too early what danger looks like. I leave you with the voices we heard today. Lewis Clarke, cut and salted, who still chose to speak. Henry Watson, who gave the world the face of a woman who delighted in torture. Louis Hughes, who named the whip as a whim. Frederick Douglass, who forced the nation to hear that white women could coerce black men and call it choice. They stand with us now. We cannot change what was done to them, but we can refuse to let it be forgotten. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.